Dear colleagues, before inviting our briefers in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I would like to say a few words in connection with the fact that Russia, when taking on the presidency of the Security Council of the UN in early July, took upon itself, as usual, the obligation to act transparently and impartially. I would like to publicly provide certain clarifications regarding the issue of Ukraine's participation in the meetings of the Council. As you recall, last time, on July 9th, Ukraine sought participation in the briefing requested by a number of Western states. However, the Russian delegation never received the appropriate format and type of request to participate in the meeting, despite having received that same request from all other participants under Rule 37. As a result, Ukraine was admitted because a request was communicated by the United States. Recalling that situation, we decided to make sure that Ukraine this time did not need to submit a request to participate in the Council because, unlike other members, they have issues with submitting a request in accordance with established practice. Under Rule 37 of the Provisional Rules of Procedure, representatives of states not part of the Council can be invited to participate in Security Council meetings. We therefore invited members of the Council to invite Ukraine and the EU to participate in today's meeting and make their contribution to the discussion. Naturally, accepting or rejecting such an invitation is the sovereign right of any state, and no state can be compelled to act in one way or another. However, one member of the Council objected to sending such an invitation, claiming that it would serve to exert pressure on Ukraine and the EU, and that they should allegedly speak in the Council only when they wish to do so. In connection with this objection, no invitation was sent to Ukraine and the EU, and we regret that this was the case. The position explained by the member of the Council was clearly contradictory to Rule 37, stating that the Council can invite any state whose interests might be affected by the meeting, and this participation is to help the Council take a decision. That is the whole thrust behind invitations under Rule 37, and not for states only to come when they have something to say. This is a perverted interpretation of the foundations of the work of the Security Council. The Council is not an open mic or a talk show. It is the primary body for the maintenance of international peace and security. On the basis, in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I give the floor, to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ought just to correct the record on that procedural matter. We explained all of this to colleagues on PCNet. But as Council members know, the very long-standing practice for briefings in the Council is that we extend an invitation to non-Council members upon their request, and we do not do it proactively as a matter of practice, and there are very good reasons for that. And fundamentally, from our perspective, it is a matter of respect for the wider UN membership. It isn't up for the Council to put pressure on non-Council members to appear before us. It is up to non-Council members to decide when their interests are engaged in a debate and when they would like to speak. We should not be in the business of trying to summon non-Council members. So we do not believe we diverted from standard practice. We are simply sticking to what we always do. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. That was pretty much the thrust of what I said, just in different word, but the meaning of your invitation was that the state you wish to invite could have made a contribution to discussions in the Council. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Director and Deputy to the High Representative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Adedeji Ebo, and Ms. Karin Kneissl, analyst. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I now give the floor.
France, пожалуйста.
France, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I apologize for taking the floor briefly, but firstly to support the interpretation of our British colleague, and secondly to encourage the Russian Federation not only to uphold the rules of procedure of the Security Council, but also the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank France for their statement. I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you. I just want to briefly second the opinion that was expressed by the United Kingdom with regard to this matter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I want to reiterate once again, and I already said this very clearly in my earlier statement, that we're of the view that is the Council that invites states to participate when it wishes to do so. Because there was no unanimity on the Council's part in this regard, we did not invite those who could have made a contribution to today's discussion because it directly affects those members of the United Nations. And I now give the floor to Mr. Adedeji Ebo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am providing this briefing on behalf of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu. Since the last briefing to the Security Council on this topic on 14 June 2024, the provision of military assistance and transfers of arms and ammunition to the armed forces of Ukraine has continued in the context of the full-scale invasion of that country launched by the Russian Federation on 24 February 2022 in violation of the UN Charter and international law. According to publicly available information, these transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions and small arms and light weapons and the ammunition. They have also included anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions. In addition, there have been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles, and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, and that these weapons have been used in Ukraine. Any transfer of weapons and ammunition must take place consistently with the applicable international legal framework, including, of course, relevant Security Council resolutions. Reports related to the use of cluster munitions and widespread contamination with mines and explosive remnants of war in Ukraine are worrying. Mines and explosive ordnance directly threaten civilians caught up in the armed conflict around the world, including in Ukraine. Even after fighting ends, these deadly devices can contaminate communities for decades to come, posing a daily and deadly danger to society and hampering reconstruction efforts. The universal participation in and the full implementation of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destruction, and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons must therefore remain a priority. Mr. President, the influx of weapons and ammunition into places where armed conflicts are ongoing can contribute to escalation and present significant risk of diversion and proliferation even after the conflict has ended. Measures to address the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition are key for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine. Such efforts will also be essential to post-conflict recovery. To prevent the diversion of arms and ammunition, supply chain transparency and cooperation and information exchange between importing, transit, and exporting states are required. Diversion risks exist at each stage of the life cycle of a weapon, including manufacture, before and during transfer, post-delivery storage in stockpiles, and end-use or disposal. Concrete counter-diversion measures include enhancement of marking, record-keeping, and tracing practices, comprehensive pre-transfer diversion risk assessments, end-user certificates, including non-transfer clauses, post-shipment verifications, and diversion monitoring and analysis. In June, states met to review progress made in the implementation of the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its international tracing instrument. They expressed collective concern about escalating tensions, crises, and conflicts aggravated by the illicit trade of these weapons, which heighten the risks of diversion of small arms and light weapons to unauthorized recipients. States adopted by consensus action-oriented measures for 2024 to 2030 in order to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons throughout their life cycle. All states should now implement these commitments and other related commitments, including those in the global framework for through-life conventional ammunition management, as well as the obligations under all instruments to which they are a party to prevent the diversion of arms and regulate international arms trade, such as the Arms Trade Treaty, the Protocol Against the Illicit Manufacturing of and Trafficking in Firearms, their parts, and components and ammunition, known as the Firearms Protocol. Mr. President, since 24 February 2022, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 34,658 civilian casualties, with 11,430 killed and 23,228 injured in Ukraine. The actual figures are likely to be considerably higher. According to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, 72% of civilian casualties in June occurred as a result of artillery shelling, multiple launch rocket systems, and aerial bombardments, while 26% were caused by missile and loitering munition strikes. It is deeply concerning that the number of casualties among children in June is the highest in 2024. The use of armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles continues to cause civilian deaths and injuries, as well as damage to civilian infrastructure. The Secretary General condemned the 8th June missile attacks by the Russian Federation, hitting residential and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. The strike reportedly killed dozens of civilians, including children, and injured over 150 more. The incidents in which missiles hit the Okhmadit National Children's Specialized Hospital in Kyiv, the largest pediatrics facility in Ukraine, and at another medical facility in the capital's Dniprovsky district are particularly concerning. In addition, there have also been reports of an increasing number of cross-border strikes using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles by Ukraine inside the Russian Federation, with some, according to the Russian authorities, reportedly resulting in civilian casualties. Just like any other weapon or weapon systems, armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. The continued and intensified attacks affecting civilians and civilian infrastructure are deeply concerning. All parties to any armed conflict have an obligation to protect civilians and to ensure compliance with applicable international law, particularly international humanitarian law. Directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, are prohibited by international humanitarian law. All such attacks must stop immediately. All parties to an armed conflict must refrain from any actions that could endanger civilians, including by avoiding the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and ultimately should aim to take combat out of urban areas altogether. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the United Nations will continue working towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with international law, including the UN Charter and all relevant General Assembly resolutions. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Karin Kneissl.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, good morning to all of you. It's my honor to join you upon invitation by the Russian UN Security Council presidency to share some elements on the vast topic of the weapons market that has been built up by European tax money in Eastern Europe. I will focus on the evident risk of trading, smuggling, briefly, the mobility of the weapons market. And in my first part, I will focus on what is well known to the United Nations, which has been seized of the matter of small weapons and light arms for decades. Let me start with one main message. Weapons travel as easily as crude oil. They truly global goods. When we look at the oil market, which I happen to be a bit more familiar with than with the arms business, those pushing for sanctions have largely failed in obstructing the Russian energy export. For oil simply is the global good par excellence. Those Europeans asking for more arms to Ukraine ignore the nature of arms trading. This might be since the arms industry is just a business, but not anymore integrated in the European state economy. It seems to me that the Hungarian government is a lonesome voice in Europe asking to stop arms supplies to Ukraine. As a neighbor, Budapest is aware of the cross-border temptations ex-fighters changing their métier might have, namely large-scale arms trading once the battles are over. I had the opportunity to observe this well-known phenomenon in Lebanon in autumn 1990, when militiamen sold the material. Apart from Hezbollah and various Palestinian factions such as the PLO, most militias were obliged to lay down their arms. The Christian Phalangists, for instance, did business with certain like-minded groups in Yugoslavia, which were also already shaken by secessionism. The arms market gradually moved across the Eastern Mediterranean to the Adriatic ports. What was sold in Junior in October 1990 was distributed in Dubrovnik in June 1991. The war in Lebanon officially stopped with another Syrian intervention, the war in Yugoslavia officially started in June 1991. It took some months for the arms traders to move to new shores. As of 1992, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions as Europe witnessed the most horrific fighting on its territory since the end of World War II. In 1999, violence erupted again in Kosovo with the NATO bombing. Until the rise in violence in the Balkans, Lebanon was the center of arms dealing for decades. Not only weapons traveled, but an entire mindset of militia mentality, drug-addicted fighters, and the business as such. The German author Bert Brecht describes it much better in his theater drama Mother Courage and Her Children than any UN report or briefing can do. War is often all about business, and the War of 30 Years in Central Europe lasted for such a long time precisely for that business reason. Some 350 years later, European mercenaries who looked for adventures and money in disintegrating Yugoslavia resembled their ancestors. And when they moved back to their countries of origin, a major part continued with visibly increased violence their criminal careers, such as bank robberies and drug dealing. According to Europol, there are 821 criminal networks with over 25,000 members across the EU. The Ukrainian arms market, marked by corruption, might increase new business opportunities for those criminals. A similar situation was observed in spring 2011, when here, at this very UN Security Council, France eagerly pushed during a busy weekend for the Security Council Resolution 1973 to enable a no-fly zone in Libya. What was started as another humanitarian intervention turned into regime change within 48 hours. The killing fields in Libya were initiated by European politicians and an activist philosopher, the notorious Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is now also part-time busy in Ukraine. The inflow of arms for the good guys in Benghazi, of course, spilled across the borders of Libya, once the best friend of the EU, due to its solid assistance in containing migration. What followed were domino effects of brutal terrorism in northwestern Africa. In addition to the Libyans, the peoples of Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali paid a high price for the European arms deliveries. Unrest and terrorism spilled over from Libya to those Sahel countries, and the weapons market found new channels across the region. It was the adoption of the Arms Trade Treaty in 2013 which marked the turning point in the international community's efforts to regulate the global trade in conventional arms and to promote peace and security. All present here are aware of its shortcomings. Some signed but did not ratify. Alas, when it comes to the tremendous inflow of weapons into Ukraine, which started in spring 2014, the diplomatic consensus on a need to contain the global flow was quickly abandoned. Europe calls for more weapons, but most of which are not made in Europe, very much to the dismay of traditional European arms builders present in this room. The recent European Council on June 27th elaborates once more on increased arms deliveries to Ukraine. As an irony of history, the European Peace Facility assistance has been in charge over the last years. Let me quote, "The European Council welcomes progress on the initiatives launched by several member states regarding ammunition and missiles, fighter jets, air defense and training, and calls for their further reinforcement and acceleration." End of quote. Useless to search for a diplomatic approach in such resolutions. Those asking for talks are considered traitors. I know that label well myself. Tanks, not talks, is the EU path, eager to push the flow of weapons to Ukraine, or at least facilitate the transit like neutral Austria does, in contrast to certain NATO members. It is in Turkey and it is in the People's Republic of China that diplomacy is practiced. Distinguished delegates, let me come back to the potential of rise in terrorism and organized crime on European soil when all those small weapons and light arms, in combination with war front experienced mercenaries, will return to their countries of origin. They might engage in fighting simply for boredom or maybe for economic reasons. The presence of former militants of the Syrian proxy war in Ukraine, but also in Germany and other EU states, is a well-established fact. As of 2016-17, many EU governments gave their green light to the elimination, it as killing, of their own citizens who were about to return from Syria, where they had been with the IS terror groups. Such extrajudicial executions were done on large scale by EU authorities to preempt those terrorists from coming back to their countries of origin inside the EU. Those EU citizens who opted to join the Islamic State in 2014 were considered terrorists for clear reasons and arrested once back home. However, those persons who recently decided to join the battlefield in Ukraine are encouraged by their respective governments to do so and never risk losing their citizenship for joining foreign armed forces or militias. In the case of Ukraine, the number of EU citizens with war front experience is probably much higher than the group of those Europeans who ravaged in Syria. Personally, I do not see the war in Ukraine turn from a conventional into a non-conventional one. But Europe will have to face the aftermath of an uncontrolled weapons market in Eastern and Central Europe. That chapter will be tougher than what the outflow of the wars in former Yugoslavia were and remain. It will mean more organized crime and more terrorism. People who will not be reintegrated in their respective societies into the EU. They will do business in the weapons market, and that will be a major headache. Let me conclude with one further thought on the European remilitarization. As somebody who has been teaching in various military academies for about 20 years, I'm aware of what had happened to the armed forces in various EU countries. They were downsized. Even the cooks were outsourced to catering firms on a contractual basis. No obligation to feed the troops in case of war, so to say. It was all about the special forces which would operate whenever in case of a terrorist attack or for regime change. All what had been taught since the 1990s, namely the end of artillery and the rise of cyber warriors, is currently revised. And Europe nowadays got an ammunition problem. Where to produce all those shells and grenades? There's a lot of talk of new generation of hypersonic missiles to be stationed in Germany, but those weapons will have to be fabricated first. And the Germany of 2024 is not the Federal Republic of Germany, the famous BRD built on an invincible Deutsche Mark. Germany is once again considered by many the sick man of Europe. In contrast to the missile stationing in the 1980s, the present-day German economy is simply not healthy enough to finance the very ambitious plans of military budget of 2% of the GDP. The envisaged return to a draft army, abandoned under Chancellor Angela Merkel, will cause heavy rifts within a fragmented German society. And it has become increasingly clear to the world it is less about material, such as Western tanks and fighter planes. It is much more about the soldiers, the humans. It was during the wars of attrition that started in 1914 that the notion of the soldier was replaced by the German notion of Menschenmaterial, human material, or human resources if you want. 110 years later, we are back to square one in the Ukrainian battlefield, which has become the gruesome stage of a larger proxy war between East and West. The German writer Erich Maria Remarque, whose novel On the Horrors of War remained topical, when he said, "Good or ill, life is life. You only realize that when you have to risk it." And that, ladies and gentlemen, holds true for every single soldier in that war on whichever side. And it turns into bewilderment when Ukrainian soldiers shout to the Russian front line, "Russians never surrender." Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Kneissl for her briefing. I will now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Russian Federation. Dear colleagues, at the outset, I would like to thank our briefers. A little over a week ago, we gathered you all in this chamber to talk about ways to bring international relations out of the deadlock in which they ended up as a result of the longstanding and deliberate policy of Western states to exclude Russia from any frameworks and equations of European and global security. Our country has been painted as an enemy violating the fundamental agreements and understandings that allowed the USSR and the United States to put an end to the Cold War. The Ukrainian crisis is just one of the consequences of that policy. Today we all know, including from declassified Western documents, that the U.S. began its crusade against Russia immediately after the collapse of the USSR, masking its actions with well-intentioned speeches and appeals. After the anti-constitutional coup of the Kiev Maidan in 2014, Ukraine became an outpost of this policy, and this friendly neighboring country was gradually molded into an anti-Russia with all of its ugly attributes: violations of the rights of Russian-speaking residents, unbridled Ukrainian nationalism and suppression of all dissent, glorification of Hitler's collaborators, and persecution of the canonical Orthodox Church. All of this, as we now know for certain today, took place under the cover of the Minsk agreements, which the Kiev regime and its Western patrons had no intention of implementing at all from the very beginning, and instead used them solely as a screen for arming Ukraine and preparing it for war with Russia. It is clear that our Western colleagues are extremely reluctant to abandon this course, the obvious victim of which is Ukraine itself. This was also clear during the aforementioned open debate on multilateralism, at which the U.S. and its allies demonstrated their absolute unwillingness to engage in any kind of dialogue and continued to employ the logic of a zero-sum game. Their supply of weapons to the Kiev regime continues, albeit with serious problems and setbacks. It is becoming difficult to ignore the widespread corruption accompanying these supplies. For example, a report by the Pentagon's Inspector General shows that the U.S. Army did not verify the accounts of contractors totaling $20 million in relation to contracts for assistance to Ukraine, and earlier it was reported that the Pentagon had filed more than 50 criminal cases over violations during the supply of military aid to Ukraine. It is clear that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and Western so-called benefactors, together with Zelensky's clique, which has entrenched itself in power, continue to rob Ukraine blind. As recently reported in the media, foreign corporations have already sold off more than half of Ukraine's arable land. What is being implemented in the country is essentially a simple and clear colonial scheme. Meanwhile, the scale of corruption in Ukraine has already reached such unprecedented levels that Ukrainian MPs are inventing new cover-ups on the fly as they go along. Here, for instance, is a remarkable example of Ukrainian know-how. In mid-July, the Ukrainian Parliament, Verkhovna Rada, approved the first reading of Bill number 11340, which will allow those suspected of taking large bribes to redeem themselves by paying that money back. Appreciate the beauty of this scheme. If you are caught accepting a bribe, you can just legally share with the state and you can continue taking bribes further. I wonder if there's a similar tax on bribe anywhere else, or is this brilliant idea something that only who mysteriously disappeared during a walk in the mountains or suddenly died of a heart attack. According to a NATO officer's confession that ended up in the media, the recent strike on Odessa killed 18 British Special Air Service personnel. It also killed members of French special forces. All of them were not mercenaries, but active military personnel. Another 25 of them were wounded. On July 23rd, about 50 foreign instructors were killed in the Kharkiv region. Yesterday, approximately 200 foreign experts were hit in Ismail. We warned about such a scenario and repeatedly warned our Western colleagues about its consequences. It seems that so far, not all of them have realized the real state of affairs on the front and the prospects for Ukraine as a state in the event that this conflict is resolved militarily. However, reality has started to hit some of them, perhaps thanks to the increasing number of publications by Western journalists that are unflattering to the Ukrainian authorities. Among those who have suddenly begun to dress up as peacekeepers, we see one of the main perpetrators of the unfolding Ukrainian tragedy, which is the former head of the British government, Boris Johnson. We all remember that it was he who dissuaded the Ukrainian ringleader in late March, early April 2022 from signing a peace agreement that was very favorable for Ukraine and had been initialed by the Ukrainian delegation at the talks in Istanbul. And this is what he says today. For the sake of peace, he argues, Ukraine could give up its demand to return to the 1991 borders and as compensation grant rights to the Russian-speaking population. The degree of cynicism on the part of this retired British politician is staggering. It turns out that the rights of the Russian-speaking residents of Ukraine are a bargaining chip in his eyes. What about the rights of the British or, say, the Flemish in Belgium or the Swedes in Finland? Is that the same for him? We must disappoint the British pseudo-peacekeeper. We do not bargain with the rights of Russian-speaking Ukrainian residents, nor do we bargain with the issue of the denazification of Ukrainian society. In our view, this is in principle the moral duty of all Europeans to ensure that these ugly phenomena are eradicated, phenomena that bring shame to European civilization itself, especially given that this is in line with the demands of the European public. For example, the head of the Ministry of Defense of Poland, Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, recently unequivocally stated, and I quote, "We must make it clear we will not see Ukraine's accession to the EU unless and until the issue of the Volyn massacre is resolved." It is difficult not to concur with this Polish politician. However, when he says A, he must also say B. This will not happen until Ukraine stops glorifying those who committed that massacre and thousands of other atrocities against Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians themselves serving their Nazi masters. I reiterate, this is something that not just Russia, but all of Europe and the entire West needs if they wish to claim even the slightest conformity with the values that our grandfathers defended together at the cost of their lives 80 years ago. Dear colleagues, the consequences of the Ukrainian crisis will not be overcome for as long as the lies on which the Kiev regime is based continue, lies that is fueled and propagated by its Western backers. These lies are multifaceted and a permanent stain on the Western narrative on Ukraine. This includes the provocation in Bucha, just one example of many, as long as the denial of many years of aggression by Kiev against the population of Donbass, and covering up the truth about the tragedy in the Odessa trade union house, as well as the truth about the true reasons of the coup in 2014 and the bloodshed that ensued. The 10th anniversary of one of these most high-profile Ukrainian untruths was commemorated several days ago. I refer to the tragedy that took place in the skies over Donbass on July 17, 2014. On that day, the Malaysian Boeing carrying out flight MH17 was shot down and all 298 people aboard were killed. That disaster had a direct impact on the course of the conflict that Ukraine had unleashed just a month before that. Struck by the scale of the tragedy, the militants back then stopped their successfully unfolding offensive against Ukrainian positions and created all the necessary conditions for Dutch investigators to work with the hopes that they would identify the true perpetrators of this tragedy. Unfortunately, those hopes were not to come to fruition, even though our country consistently advocated the conduct of an independent, comprehensive, and credible investigation into the tragedy. Russia was at the origins of the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2166 and remains fully committed to its implementation in the interest of establishing the truth and bringing those responsible to justice. However, the biased conclusions of the technical investigation carried out by the Dutch Safety Board and the subsequent criminal investigation by the Joint Investigative Team, which consisted of states hostile to Russia, is something that we cannot accept. Their only goal was to hastily concoct an indictment of Russia's involvement in the Boeing crash and to make a sloppy attempt to make the evidence fit that conclusion. Our proposals to work together were rejected, and the irrefutable data that we provided, which fully excluded any possibility that the rocket was fired from territory under the control of our militias, were ignored. The Netherlands, following anti-Russian logics, have not found it within themselves over the past 10 years to investigate the tragedy in detail. The clear issue of Ukraine's responsibility for not closing their airspace over the area of hostilities was not looked into, as well as many other glaring circumstances. Moreover, with the active support of their allies, The Hague is trying to use its dubious experience in the MH17 case in various international fora, including the ICAO Board and the European Court of Human Rights, in order to cement the false version of Russia's involvement in the Boeing crash in the eyes of the international community. In ICAO, Russia provided a vast and convincing amount of evidence testifying to our country's non-involvement in the crash, and we called the organization to carry out an impartial investigation into all the circumstances of the tragedy, which ICAO refused to do. It is also telling that parties ignored the decision of the ICJ of January 31st, 2024 on the proceedings initiated by Ukraine in January 2017. That decision rejected the Ukrainian demand that Russia be held responsible for the crash of the Boeing. We must regrettably acknowledge the lack of a comprehensive, detailed, and depoliticized impartial investigation. The politically biased versions promoted by the Netherlands and their colleagues are protecting Kiev and deliberately ignoring all facts that point to its responsibility for the tragedy. There can be no talk of objectivity and restoring justice in this regard. We express our condolences to all those who lost their loved ones over Donbass 10 years ago. We would like to believe that the truth will one day come out about these events and their true perpetrators, and that those who covered for them as well will all receive the punishment they deserve. But unfortunately, this is still a long way off. Dear colleagues, in conclusion, I would like to touch upon another matter. The situation of the Ukrainian army is so catastrophic that in recent days we have seen a number of statements from the leaders of the Kiev regime who have hastily put on sheep's clothing and now claim that they are supposedly ready to engage in peace talks with Russia. We have heard such statements from the Kiev ringleader himself, who has lost all legitimacy, as well as his subordinates. I will say right away in this regard that Kiev's purported willingness to engage in negotiations as such is in line with our position that the diplomatic path is the preferable way to resolve the Ukrainian conflict. As you know, we have never rejected negotiations. It was Zelensky and his clique who rejected them at the instigation of their Western sponsors. When it comes to such issues, it is the details and nuances that are important, and these are precisely the things that we don't know. But we do know that back in November 2022, the Kiev ringleader legislatively barred himself and his subordinates from engaging any talks with Russian authorities, and that decree is still in force. We also know that just recently, the Kiev authorities promoted the so-called Zelensky pseudo-peace formula as the only basis for negotiations acceptable to them. This formula makes no sense from the point of view of basic logic as well as the actual situation on the front lines. So we have many questions without answers to which we cannot assess the nature of the modified Ukrainian position. Perhaps some clarity could have been brought today by the representative of the Kiev regime, but for reasons known only to him, he ignored our invitation to participate today, as did the representative of the EU, once again demonstrating the unwillingness of this once influential union to engage in any sort of diplomatic efforts whatsoever. The fact that Kiev's Western sponsors believed that it was unnecessary to have a representative of the Kiev regime participate in today's meeting dedicated to Ukraine is very telling. It just once again shows that today's Ukraine cannot make any sovereign decisions in principle. Well, colleagues, before people are sent to us asked to assess the potential change of position on the part of the leader of the Kiev regime, who has long reached his expiration dates and is failing on the front, we would ask that you get into and find out the details of his epiphany. It's possible that his views have not changed at all, and if he is finally ready to talk about peace, then he has the peace proposals put forth by the Russian president a month ago, and we advise him to hurry because Ukraine will certainly not be offered anything better at this point, and there is absolutely no way that it will get a break on the battlefield in the form of a preliminary ceasefire. We have seen on the example of the Minsk agreements that such arrangements with Ukraine cannot be trusted. And while the Kiev chieftain is considering this proposal, our military operation will continue, and its objective will be achieved either on the battlefield or as a result of talks. Which one is for Kiev to decide? I thank you, and I resume my function as the president of the Security Council, and I give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Director Ebo for his briefing. I also take note of the statement by Ms. Kneissl. Mr. President, let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. Firstly, as a staunch supporter of international law, Slovenia cannot and will not accept this aggression and rejects this violent attempt at land acquisition, as well as any and all international law violations that took place since its start over 2 years ago. Ukraine is defending itself in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter. Slovenia sees its assistance to Ukraine not only as supporting the protection of its civilians against drones and missiles, but also as protecting the Charter against erosion of its basic tenets. With this in mind, I can inform that my Prime Minister and President Zelensky have signed a security agreement between Slovenia and Ukraine just last week. This solidifies Slovenia's support to Ukraine's self-defensive efforts and highlights Slovenia's commitment to humanitarian aid for Ukrainians. Secondly, as we discuss transfers of arms that support Ukrainian defense against aggression, it is becoming increasingly hard to ignore reports that Russia is replenishing its arsenal by importing missiles and artillery shells from the DPRK. While transfers to Ukraine are in line with the international legal framework, transfers of weapons from the DPRK violate multiple Security Council resolutions. Procurement of weapons from the DPRK supports the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and destabilizes two parts of the globe at the same time. Mr. President, our discussions on Ukraine's self-defense have security implications for countries like mine. However, we know that there is only one long-term security guarantee for everyone: strict application and respect for international law. This is why we will be one of the first to man the barricades in defense of the UN Charter. This is why you will always hear us exposing double standards in application of international humanitarian law, and this is why we will keep supporting Ukraine until there is an aggressor on its soil. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Slovenia for their statement, and I give the floor to Switzerland.
President, I thank the Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Ebo, for his speech, and I have also taken note of Ms. Kneissl's remarks. Last week, we discussed the importance of respecting the United Nations Charter in order to preserve our multilateral order. It is precisely this charter that forms the basis of the international legal order. It enshrines the prohibition on the use of force, the right to self-defense, and in particular, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. We recall that the current situation giving rise to this meeting is a direct consequence of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, in clear violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. We condemn this military aggression and reject any attempt to evade responsibility for it. Over the past 2 weeks, Ukraine has once again been the victim of Russian attacks. These included, amongst others, a children's hospital in Kyiv. We reiterate that medical and humanitarian personnel and infrastructure must be respected and protected. Yesterday, other attacks in Kharkiv damaged, amongst others, the office of the Fondation Suisse de Déminage, the demining foundation of Switzerland, which is one of our important partners in the implementation of humanitarian demining. This reminds us of the dangerous conditions in which humanitarian workers operate, including in the field of humanitarian demining, which is an essential prerequisite for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Switzerland condemns these recent attacks and reiterates its call upon all parties to strictly respect international law, in particular international humanitarian law and human rights. The civilian population and civilian infrastructures must not be targeted. We are deeply dismayed by the fact that Russia's military aggression appears to continue to be fueled by transfers of arms and munitions to Russia from third parties, notably Iran and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We have repeatedly stressed that states must respect and comply with their obligations under international arms control instruments. This includes the relevant resolutions of this Council. President, in order to achieve a peaceful solution, we renew our appeal to Russia to cease all hostilities and to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. The Summit on Peace in Ukraine in June marks Switzerland's ongoing commitment to peace and dialogue. Switzerland remains determined to do everything in its power to contribute to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on the United Nations Charter and the fundamental principles of international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Deputy High Representative Ebo, for your briefing. Colleagues, before beginning my statement, I would just like to say that the lies, fabrications, threats, distortions, and historical revisionism on the part of the representative of the Russian Federation show no bounds. It's quite unfortunate that we had to, everyone had to sit here and listen to that. 2 weeks ago, Russia lectured the Security Council on multilateral cooperation, even as it blatantly violated the UN Charter by continuing to wage its brutal war against Ukraine. Today, Russia's hypocrisy is once again on full display, misusing the Security Council as a platform to broadcast its disinformation. Despite repeated calls from more than 140 countries for Russia to end its war of aggression, a few countries have deepened their support to Russia. Today, I'd like to focus on China, the DPRK, and Iran's military support to Russia that is directly contributing to Russia's war against Ukraine. China's so-called no-limits partnership and large-scale support is propping up the Russian defense industrial base. Despite its calls on countries not to prolong the conflict, China is exporting to Russia nitrocellulose, which, for those who don't know, is a highly flammable compound, machine tools, microelectronics, optics, and UAV and cruise missile technology that are prolonging and enabling Russia's violation of the UN Charter through its invasion of Ukraine. Russia deploys its acquisitions from China in attacks that kill civilians and destroy Ukraine's infrastructure. We need only look to Russia's appalling attack on Akhmatdakhti Children's Hospital to see the consequences of supporting Russia's defense industrial base. Collectively, exports from China have given the Russian war effort a lifeline and are increasing the threat Russia poses to Euro-Atlantic security. The DPRK has unlawfully transferred dozens of ballistic missiles and over 15,000 containers of munitions to aid Russia's war against Ukraine, prolonging the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Last month, an expert from a leading independent think tank, Conflict Armament Research, described to the Security Council his trip to Ukraine to inspect debris from a ballistic missile that hit Kharkiv on January 2nd. He shared photographs of the missile debris and described its distinct jet vane actuators, the bolt pattern around the igniter, and the presence of Korean characters on specific rocket components. This independent determination that the ballistic missile had been manufactured in the DPRK corroborates the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency analysis published on May 29. Russia's procurement of DPRK ballistic missiles violates the UN arms embargo on the DPRK that Russia itself supported. Troublingly, Moscow and Pyongyang have also signed a mutual defense treaty and elevated ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership after Putin's visit in late June. Russia-DPRK alignment evidences a dangerous quid pro quo. Russia shields the DPRK from UN scrutiny, allowing the Kim regime to continue developing unlawful ballistic missiles so long as the DPRK supplies those arms for the Kremlin's war effort. That kind of quid pro quo undermines this institution. We must hold one another to account and uphold our obligations under international law. Credible reporting suggests that Moscow plans to follow the same playbook with Tehran, elevating bilateral ties with a comprehensive bilateral agreement. Iran is another country that continues to fuel Russia's war of aggression with direct military support, providing Iranian UAVs, which the Kremlin is using to devastating effect against Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. I would also like to highlight the serious consequences of Iran potentially transferring ballistic missiles and related technology to Russia. To that end, we urge all countries to cease military cooperation with Russia and to halt materiel and political support for its war of aggression against Ukraine. Such support to a country that violated the UN Charter only pours fuel on the fire. The NATO Washington Summit Declaration demonstrated that many countries share these concerns. Here in New York, at the General Assembly on July 11, 100 countries also demanded that Russia return control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to the sovereign and competent authorities of Ukraine. Again, the hypocrisy of Russia calling for this meeting should not be lost on Security Council members. We cannot allow Russia to unabashedly promote its disinformation while it wages a war of aggression for territorial conquest against a fellow UN member state. The United States remains committed to providing Ukraine what it needs to defend itself in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We call on all countries to support Ukraine's pursuit of a just and lasting peace consistent with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. We regret that Russia has shown no support or readiness for good faith negotiations or engagement on such a peace, including the Kremlin's refusal to participate in Ukraine's second peace summit. The United States will continue to stand by Ukraine. We will continue to call for justice for the victims of the Kremlin's war of aggression and accountability for those responsible. Colleagues, in closing, let me make one final point. It is obvious to everyone that there is a clear difference with supporting the efforts of a country to defend itself in line with the UN Charter, and those supporting an international terrorist group sanctioned at the UN. The fact that Russia and its chosen briefers cannot tell the difference, frankly, tells you everything you need to know. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing and take note of Dr. Kneissl's contribution to the discussion. Guyana remains concerned about the mounting civilian casualties and widespread destruction sustained in the ongoing war. We maintain that any lasting solution will not be achieved through military action. It must be done through diplomacy and good faith negotiations conducted in accordance with the provisions of the United Nations Charter and international law. We reiterate our call for the parties to the conflict to commit in good faith to a serious political and diplomatic process towards ending the conflict. The tragic human toll of the war and its devastating impact on regional stability and international security cannot be overemphasized. Guyana condemns the use of violence against civilians and the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and calls upon the parties to uphold their obligations under international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and to respect the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. We also demand that they ensure the safety of civilians and humanitarian workers in the affected areas. Mr. President, the updates provided by Mr. Ebo regarding the transfer of weapons are concerning. Guyana continues to stress that the supply of weapons and ammunition in any armed conflict situation risks further escalating or prolonging the violence and present a significant risk of their diversion to unauthorized end users. Each year, we receive increasingly harrowing reports of the detrimental impact of the diversion, illicit trafficking, and proliferation of weapons, especially of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition, on entire communities and their disproportionate impact on women and girls. We must do more to ensure effective arms control measures and prevent further instability and insecurity in the world. In this regard, Guyana urges all parties to ensure that the transfers are transparent, conducted within international legal frameworks, and have stringent provisions for controls to prevent their irregular transfer. As a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Anti-Personnel Landmine Convention, and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, Guyana deplores the use of these weapons and calls for full compliance with international law and international disarmament instruments and obligations. We further encourage states that are not yet party to these treaties to accede to them. Mr. President, in closing, I wish to once again stress the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. We call again for the Russian Federation to withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and encourage the international community to redouble its efforts to secure lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank Guyana for their statement, and I give the floor to Algeria.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Ebo for his intervention. We've also taken good note of the comprehensive briefing of Mrs. Kneissl. Mr. President, our position on this conflict remains crystal clear. We stressed it time and again in different meetings of this Council. We stressed that the just and lasting peace is vital to end this crisis, peace ingrained in the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, the peace that takes into consideration the security concerns of all relevant parties to the conflict. In today's deliberations, we would like to stress the following points. First, The increased proliferation of weapons in conflict zones remains a source of deep concern. The influx of such weapons would undoubtedly lead to further loss of lives, a prolongation of the civilian suffering, and additional hurdles undermining the path towards diplomatic solutions to the conflict. Second, we reiterate our urgent call to all parties to refrain from the escalatory narrative and prioritize the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. In this vein, we must act to alleviate the suffering of those affected by the conflict. Moreover, all parties must strictly adhere to its obligations pursuant to international law, especially the international humanitarian law. Third, the growing polarization will only lead to further escalation of tension and a protracted crisis. Thus, it is vital to redouble international diplomatic effort to bring about sustained peace. Fourth, my country calls upon all parties to de-escalate, refrain from confrontation, and establish the conditions conducive to comprehensive and productive dialogue and negotiations. This would be in line with the principle of the peaceful settlement of disputes. To conclude, Mr. President, Algeria reiterates its strong commitment to support any initiative aimed at maintaining international peace and security, whether in the region or in the world. We support a peaceful settlement in line with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and the legitimate security concerns of all parties. Thank you.
I thank Algeria for their statement, and I give the floor to France.
President, I thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. A few days ago, Russia invited the member states to discuss multilateral cooperation with a view to a just and sustainable world order. There were several people who were rather surprised about this initiative at the very time when Russia is undermining the foundations of our multilateral system with its large-scale aggression against a sovereign state, in violation of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. According to this same logic, Russia is today organizing a meeting, the 17th, to accuse weapons deliveries to Ukraine of being responsible for a war which Russia alone unleashed. Almost 2.5 years ago, Russia launched an illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, whilst this state was not threatening Russia in any way. Since then, Russia has decided to continue this war despite the resolutions adopted by a very large majority in the General Assembly condemning this war unequivocally. To achieve its ends, Russia is ready to weaken the international non-proliferation architecture, which is one of the guarantors of our collective security. In violation of Security Council resolutions, Russia receives deliveries of weapons and munitions from North Korea. It uses ballistic missiles from North Korea against Ukraine. It is stepping up its military cooperation with Pyongyang, allowing the North Korean regime to advance its illicit programs at the cost of an irresponsible normalization of the nuclear threat. Russia has also received armed drones from Iran in violation of Resolution 2231. France underlines once again our deep dismay regarding information of possible transfers of Iranian ballistic missiles to Russia. If confirmed, we would respond in a resolute and coordinated manner, including with new broad-reaching measures. Moreover, we exhort all states to abstain from providing Russia with dual-use goods and components which could support its war of aggression. In order to sap the cohesion of the Ukrainian people, Russia is deliberately striking civilian populations and infrastructure in Ukraine in violation of international humanitarian law. One of the latest examples is the salvo of strikes on the 8th of July hitting the Ohmedit Children's Hospital. President, in the face of this aggression, Ukraine has the right to defend itself, pursuant to Article 51 of the Charter. Along with many partners, France has chosen to provide Ukraine with the means to exercise this right. This is why we have decided to grant military support and transfers of material to Ukraine. It is in order to defend itself that Ukraine must be able to neutralize military targets in Russian territory which are directly involved in the operations targeting Ukraine. France will continue to provide Ukraine with the support necessary for its legitimate defense as long as this is necessary. It is Russia and Russia alone which is choosing to continue this war. It could bring an end to the war today. All it would need to do would be to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory, as asked of it by the International Court of Justice since the 16th of March 2022. Our military support, which allows Ukraine to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, aims to establish the conditions for negotiations which will open the way to just and lasting peace. Such peace cannot come from armed aggression nor from forcibly imposed border changes. I thank you.
I thank France for their statement, and I give the floor to Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Mr. Adedeji Ebo, Deputy to the High Representative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, for his briefing. We note the contribution of Ms. Karin Kneissl. We take note of the different perspectives presented on the supply of arms with respect to the conflict in Ukraine, including those relating to the continuous supply of weapons having the potential to prolong and escalate the level of violence in the conflict, potentially leading to a state of attrition. Notwithstanding the increased civilian deaths, injuries and displacements, as well as massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, the gains achieved by both sides in the conflict does not point towards total victory. The situation appears to be a stalemate, and if the military objectives remain unachieved, political dialogue and settlement should be pursued. The alarming civilian casualties and the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine since the start of the conflict to date underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and the pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to de-escalate tensions and pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. Sierra Leone reiterates its commitment to upholding the principles of international law and the United Nations Charter, emphasizing the importance of respecting national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and encouraging peaceful settlement of disputes. We also reiterate our principal position that all transfers of weapons in conflict situations should occur within the applicable international legal framework and relevant UN Security Council resolution, and include pre-transfer risk assessments and end-user verification to prevent diversion of arms and ammunition. In closing, Mr. President, Sierra Leone calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and genuine diplomatic efforts to achieve a peaceful and lasting resolution to the conflict, taking into account the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you, President. I am grateful to the briefers for their informative briefings. Ecuador shares the concerns of the Deputy to the High Representative, Adedeji Ebo, particularly regarding the risks around the inflow of weapons and munitions, and we support his recommendations regarding the necessary measures to mitigate such risks. Legitimate defense is continued within and should be framed by by the Charter. The transfer of arms and munitions must adhere to the applicable international legal framework and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. All member states must carry out comprehensive risk assessments to prevent the diversion, illicit trafficking and misuse of weapons. It is necessary to tighten the standards on marking, registration and traceability of arms and munitions to avoid seeing them reappear elsewhere in the world, including in Latin America, and to avoid them being misused by transnational organized crime groups or terrorists. Unfortunately, after 29 months, 883 days since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, there is still a persistent lack of true will to participate in dialogue and make significant efforts to bring an end to military clashes. Rather than decreasing, the hostilities are intensifying, with civilians bearing the brunt of the conflict. I reiterate the urgency of the attacks against the civilian population infrastructure ceasing, and I urge and stress the responsibility upon the parties to fully abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution. Likewise, Ecuador reiterates the need to protect all nuclear facilities in Ukraine, including the Zaporizhzhia power plant, by implementing the 7 nuclear security pillars and the 5 fundamental principles outlined by the IAEA. President, colleagues, the increase in nuclear rhetoric and the stepping up of hostilities are cause for global concern. The path of escalation generates only greater devastation and erodes the basis for any viable peace process. I therefore reiterate my delegation's call for an end to the violence, an end to the illegal occupation, and a resumption of dialogue and diplomacy, which will allow peace to be restored in the context of a respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to thank the briefers for the informative presentations. Mr. President, almost 2 years and a half have elapsed since the outbreak of this conflict. The situation continues to deteriorate with no signs of improvement on site, and innocent civilians bearing the brunt of the hostilities. This persists despite repeated calls by the international community for the cessation of hostilities and the resumption of direct negotiation between the parties involved. The increasing trend in arms transfer is yet another sign of the escalatory trajectory of this conflict. The primacy given to military approach at the expense of negotiated and peaceful solutions only leads to further death, destruction and chaos. Mr. President, we recognize the sovereign right of each and every country to self-defense and to adopt the necessary measures to that end, including through arms supplies. However, we firmly believe that if not carefully handled by the conflicting parties and their allies, arms transfer can have devastating consequences on both countries in the region and the world at large. History has shown that the availability, proliferation, and massive arms supplies can aggravate conflicts, insecurity, and ultimately divert resources from critical areas of development to sustain wars. Given this complex and fragile context, mitigation measures are crucial. Therefore, we underscore the importance of responsible arms transfer within existing international legal framework. Responsible arms transfers are indispensable tools to enhance transparency, reduce uncertainty, and promote strategic stability. They can potentially contribute to establishing communication channels that may help to build the much-needed confidence and trust between the parties. However, to be effective, all mitigation measures, including those related to arms control, should not be seen in isolation. They must be taken as a complement to other necessary measures, including the political one, aiming at finding an agreeable solution. It is against this backdrop that Mozambique consistently advocates for a political and negotiated solution as the only viable way to end this conflict and sustain peace. We reiterate our call to the conflicting parties to immediately cease hostilities, resume direct negotiations without any prerequisites, and actively engage in constructive and meaningful dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. And I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also extend my gratitude to Mr. Ebo for the briefing and also take note of Ms. Kneisl's remarks. At the outset, simply clear, my delegation reiterates its consistent position that Ukraine is defending its people and territories in the exercise of its inherent right to self-defense, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter, alongside the international community's assistance. For this reason, we are of the view that today's meeting on the issue of weapons transfers to Ukraine is irrelevant. Instead, for example, this Council should address in depth Russia's illegal weapons procurement from the DPRK and the worrying trend of enhanced military cooperation between Pyongyang and Moscow, which is in violation of multiple Security Council resolutions adopted unanimously in this chamber. This is all the more necessary after Russia vetoed the mandate renewal of the 1718 Committee panel of experts, which was serving as the crucial monitoring mechanism on violation or invasion of sanctions imposed upon DPRK. Despite recurrent warnings from the international community, the two countries are now pursuing deepened military cooperation following Russia's President Putin's visit to Pyongyang, as shown by their comprehensive strategic partnership treaty and the recent meeting between Russia's Vice Defense Minister and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang. In addition to violating multiple Security Council resolutions, such military cooperation poses a serious threat to international peace and security and undermines the global non-proliferation regime. It is indeed regrettable that while all state parties to the NPT are now working together in Geneva to strengthen and uphold the non-proliferation regime, a permanent member of the Council with the largest number of nuclear weapons is intensifying dangerous military cooperation with the world's most serious nuclear proliferator. Colleagues, since the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has undermined international laws and global norms on multiple levels, and we have witnessed the untold human sufferings this war caused in Ukraine and beyond. We once again urge Russia to end this war by withdrawing its troops from the territories of Ukraine, as affirmed by multiple UNGA resolutions underpinned with the clear support of the majority of UN members. We believe the first summit on peace in Ukraine held in Switzerland last month laid important groundwork toward achieving lasting peace in Ukraine. At the same time, we support all diplomatic efforts to end this war. But this diplomatic effort should be in line with the UN Charter and international law. For our part, the Republic of Korea will continue to stand with Ukraine, its people, in their endeavors to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, as reaffirmed by our President at the NATO summit earlier this month. I thank you.
As the President of the Security Council, I'm obligated to thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Mr. President, I begin by thanking Mr. Ebo for his briefing. It is deeply regrettable that the Russian Federation continues to try to justify its flagrant violations of international law and the principles of the UN Charter by requesting yet another meeting on Western arms deliveries to Ukraine. Let us be clear, Western weapons are not the cause of this senseless war, nor the reason for its prolongation. Russia's unrelenting aggression against its neighbor is the sole reason for this conflict. If Russia had to withdraw from Ukraine today, the war would end today. Until that day comes, Ukraine has no alternative but to exercise its right to defend itself. In the areas it has temporarily occupied, Russia has brought suffering, death, and destruction, not peace. To allow Russia to continue with these actions is to reward an open act of aggression being committed daily in full violation of the UN Charter. For months, Ukraine's electricity grid has faced repeated Russian missile and drone attacks that have destroyed about half of the country's generating capacity. Knocked out power plants caused a widespread blackout across the entire country. The continued and intensified attacks affecting civilians and civilian infrastructure are deeply concerning. The shelling against Kiev and other urban centers on 8 July marked one of the worst days of violence against civilians in months, destroying two of the country's main specialist hospitals for children and women. Furthermore, last week's attack in the Donetsk region and Mykolaiv city destroyed homes and critical civilian infrastructure, killing and injuring dozens of civilians. We stress once again that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are against international humanitarian law and must stop immediately. There must be full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. We also support the ongoing work of the ICC and the Register of Damage for Ukraine. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate, causing the largest displacement in Kharkiv and Donetsk regions. According to OCHA, more than 14.6 million people require some form of humanitarian assistance. Malta is also concerned about recent reports related to the use of cluster munitions and widespread contamination with mines and explosive remnants of war. Around 297 individuals have lost their lives due to mine explosions and other explosive hazard, including 15 children. Protecting the people of Ukraine and ensuring the recovery from the devastation caused by Russia's war require that the mining happens without delay. We are also deeply concerned over the mounting evidence of Russia's procurement and use of DPRK missiles against Ukraine. This is in clear violation of Security Council resolutions and the sanctions regime. Malta welcomes the adoption of the General Assembly resolution regarding the threats posed to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It serves as a powerful message to ensure nuclear safety and security and Ukraine's territorial integrity. To conclude, President, Malta reiterates that the only path to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace is for Russia to immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
As the President of the Security Council, I am obligated to thank the representative of Malta for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank Mr. Ebo for your briefing. Colleagues, on 24th of February 2022, many of us were sitting in this council when we learned the terrible news that Russia had launched an illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. On that day, and on every one of the 882 days since, Ukraine has been bravely exercising its right to self-defense under the UN Charter. Ukraine has defended its sovereign land, and it has rejected Russia's vision for a world where states can change borders by force. It has stood up for the very principles and the heart of the UN Charter. And the UK's commitment to support Ukraine is ironclad. I would like to use my remarks today to make 3 points. First, we must never lose sight of the terrible human cost of the war in Ukraine, Putin's war of choice. Just a few weeks ago, we met after a Russian missile reduced a children's hospital in Kyiv to rubble. This was the latest example of the horrific attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure, which have resulted in over 34,000 civilians confirmed killed and injured since the invasion began, and which have left over 14.6 million Ukrainians in need of humanitarian assistance. The Russian people are also experiencing the terrible consequences of this invasion. Nearly 70,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the last 60 days alone, adding to more than 500,000 Russian troops killed or wounded since the start of the invasion. Second, Russia has become increasingly desperate to procure weapons to sustain its attacks on Ukraine. Russia has received hundreds of drones from Iran and significant quantities of weapons from the DPRK. It is absurd, but frankly no longer surprising, that Russia criticizes legitimate Western support for Ukraine's self-defense, while it procures weapons from the DPRK in flagrant violation of Security Council resolutions that it supported. We reiterate our call on all third parties immediately to cease supporting, by material support, Russia's war of aggression. Third, the UK, together with our allies and partners, will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. At the NATO summit earlier this month, the UK, alongside 22 other countries and the European Union, signed up to the Ukraine Compact. This declared our enduring commitment to support Ukraine's self-defense and to deter aggression. Our resolve will not waver. The UK has committed to sustain current levels of military support to Ukraine for as long as it takes, and we will continue to support Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression until a just and lasting peace is secured in line with the UN Charter. It is for Ukraine to determine its position in any negotiations, just as it is for Ukraine to determine its democratic future. Ukraine is a sovereign country making sovereign decisions about the defense of its sovereign land, and the sooner Russia understands this, the better. I thank you.
I thank the United Kingdom for their statement, and I give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Deputy High Representative Adedeji Ebo and the other briefer for their briefings. As you may recall, on the 9th of this month, France and Ecuador requested a Security Council meeting following Russia's attack on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including a hospital for children in Ukraine. We once again condemn such heinous attacks in the strongest terms. Every month, Russia continues its abusive practice of requesting meetings on Ukraine whenever other member states do so, merely to match the numbers. By doing so, Russia has wasted so much of the Council's precious time and resources. Today's meeting is no exception. When it comes to Ukraine, Russia's intention in the Council has been consistent and clear. It attempts to place itself, the violator of the UN Charter, and its victims on the same moral footing, trying to justify its actions in vain. For more than 2 years, Russia has engaged in hypocrisy and attempts to use the Security Council as a platform for disinformation. It is totally unacceptable to compare Russia's action with Ukraine's legitimate defense against aggression and the entirely lawful and justified international support it receives. At the start of the aggression in February 2022, an overwhelming majority of the General Assembly declared who was violating the UN Charter by attacking a sovereign neighboring state. This fact has not and will not change. The fact of Russia's procurement of ballistic missiles from North Korea in violation of Security Council resolution and their use in Ukraine has not and will not change. The fact of Russia used its veto to end the mandate of the panel of experts that monitored the implementation of those Security Council resolutions has not and will not change. No one wishes for further escalation of harm. The path towards peace is simple: an immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. Since this is an unprovoked war of aggression that Russia started, it will end if Russia decides to do so. Next month, Ukraine will commemorate its Independence Day. As a friend and partner of the independent state of Ukraine, Japan reaffirms its strong and unequivocal stance in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Japan, standing with Ukraine and its people for them to achieve a just and lasting peace, has not and will not change. I thank you.
I thank Japan for their statement, and I give the floor to Japan. I give the floor to China. The interpreter has made a mistake and said Japan instead. The floor goes to China.
Thank you, President. I thank Mr. Ebo and Ms. Kneissl for their briefings. In the protracted crisis in Ukraine, civilians are the ones who suffer the most. The continued flow of weapons and ammunition into the battleground will only further aggravate the crisis and deepen the cruelty, danger, and unpredictability that war brings, resulting in even more innocent casualties, while diminishing the hope for a peaceful end to the fighting, and creating profound and broad negative impact to regional peace and stability. It is therefore in the best interests of all parties to seek a political settlement by way of an early end to the fighting. At present, the focus should be on observing the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no fanning the flames by any party, so as to promote a de-escalation of the situation as soon as possible. Recently, the parties to the conflict have, to varying degrees, signaled their willingness to negotiate. We expect them to continue to show political will, walk towards each other rather than away from each other, and start peace talks as soon as possible. The international community should create conditions and provide assistance in this regard, and work together for a political settlement of the crisis. President, the Ukrainian crisis occurred against the backdrop of historical complexities and practical realities. It is, in essence, an eruption of security dynamics in Europe. China had no part in creating this crisis, nor is it a party to the conflict. China has not provided lethal weaponry to any party to the conflict, has not and will not do anything to profit from it. China's position on the Ukrainian issue has been consistent and clear. It is to urge and promote peace through a political settlement. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba is currently on visit to China. Foreign Minister Wang Yi held talks with him, where both sides had an in-depth exchanges of views on the Ukrainian crisis. We note that Foreign Minister Kuleba said that Ukraine values China's views and has carefully studied the 6-point understandings proposed by China and Brazil on the political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, and that Ukraine is willing and ready to engage in dialogue and negotiation with Russia. China will continue to uphold an objective and impartial position, stand on the side of dialogue and peace, support the international community in forging more consensus, and work tirelessly and constructively to promote an early political settlement of the crisis. President, in his statement a moment ago, the U.S. representative resorted to tactics of slandering and smearing towards China in an attempt to create a false narrative, mislead the international community, and shift the blame to China on the issue of Ukraine, which China categorically rejects. I wish to reiterate that China is not a creator of the Ukrainian crisis, much less a party to it. However, we have not stood by with folded arms. On the contrary, we have all along insisted on promoting peace and negotiation and on pushing for a political solution, which the international community can bear witness. And this is not something that the United States can write off simply by resorting to slandering and a few untruths. China has never poured oil on the fire or taken advantage of the situation, nor has it provided lethal weapons to any party to the conflict. China exercises strict control over military and civilian dual-use items. The Chinese enterprises carry out normal economic and trade cooperations with other countries, including Russia and Ukraine, in accordance with the rules of the WTO and the rules of the market, is something that is reasonable. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. There are no more speakers inscribed on my list. The meeting is adjourned.